past several years, we've had the chance to share about Colton's miracle, our miracle, the miracle that God has done for us.
We went to the Butterfly Pavilion, and during that time, Cassie and I both got sick. She and I were both throwing up. In a few days, she got better, I got worse.
But we took him to the doctor, and they thought, well, he just has a worse case. Well, we found out later that his appendix had ruptured. He was one messed up little kid.
There was nothing we could do at that point. It was up to God.
I just rage had taken over. I was just mad. But I took that rage to God. As soon as we get to the hospital room, I remember him looking up to me and he says, "Dad, you know I almost died." That terrified me.
We knew we had a miracle. We just didn't know how big until later when we started listening to where he'd been.
And we joked with him, we said, "Colton, we're in North Platte, do you want to go back to the hospital?" And he's like, "Oh no, I don't want to go back. Send Cassie, let her go," you know? We're kind of chuckling, and he goes, "But you know, Dad, that's where the angels sang to me." They sang to me when I was there. Finally, we're like, okay, wait a minute.
Well, how it started was I lifted above my body and I could see myself on the table and I was freaking out. But I was sitting on Jesus' lap and he had the angels sing to calm me down.
And then he says, "Well, Dad, I could see you." And then that's where time stopped for me. What do you mean you could see me? He starts telling me, "You went to a room by yourself, Dad, and you were yelling at God, and I saw you." Nobody knew where I was and what I was doing. And here my son saying, "Dad, I saw you in that room." And he asked me the question, "Well, is Pop your mom's dad or your dad's dad?" I goes, "My mom's dad." He goes, "Well, Dad, he's really nice." I'm like, "He's really nice?" "Yeah, he was. He's my favorite granddad. I hope to see him." "Oh, you will. He's in heaven." And that's when he starts to share with me how I used to play with him as a kid and fix things with him and work on the combine with him and all. And all of a sudden I'm sitting there and it's like, "How do you know that?" "Well, he told me, Dad." You know, he talks about meeting his sister in heaven and Pop in heaven. We'd had a miscarriage too.
There was a little girl who came running out of the gates of heaven. And she ran up to me and gave me a hug.
But it was a very emotional, dark thing we thought we'd gotten over. But to realize that miracle of life is not gone. It's just moved on to another place and is doing fine. And Jesus is taking care of it. And there's tons and tons and tons of kids running around. And it's just the comfort.
Jesus came up to me and said, "Colton, you have to go back because I'm answering your dad's prayer." There's two ways you can picture heaven. You can either picture it as the perfect version of earth because there's no sin, there's no night, and it's just a beautiful place to be in. And another is the city that never stops growing because heaven has to keep growing for all the people that live there.
I think it's kind of formed him as a person. And then he's been effective to Cassie and Colby. He's caused their faith to grow. And then, of course, it's strengthened Todd and I's faith. It's made heaven more tangible. You know, we're only here for a split second. We're somewhere for eternity. We get to decide where we go, but we're somewhere for eternity. And so it's made us realize we're more adamant about telling people, you need to make a decision. Because our kid almost didn't make it to 4.
And Jesus said, "Unless you change and become like a child, you shall never enter the kingdom of heaven." So only a kid can accept heaven with the childlike faith that God wants us to have. So here's a kid who accepts it, believes it, this is how it is. I don't know how it all works, but this is how it is.
Heaven is such an amazing place that you never want to leave.
Would you join me in welcoming Todd and Colton Burpo to Katy, Texas? Welcome. We are so glad you guys are here. We had dinner last night and got to know each other, and we want to do a deep dive into heaven. But before we do that, y'all are real people with real lives right now. So this, Todd, start with you. Just update us on your family. Where are you guys living now? What are you doing?
Well, just a little over 2 years ago, God just told me that he wanted me to move to this town in Colorado, so we live in Colorado. Went from the Bible Belt to where I live now. 4% of the people are Christians. So culture shocked us, and yet at the same time, what an opportunity just to share with people about Christ almost every day. My wife, she's a school teacher. She's teaching middle school. My daughter just celebrated her 1-year anniversary. And I even like my son-in-law. Praise God, and that's wonderful, right, But I don't know. I think my wife likes him more than my daughter does, so I don't know. But Colton, he's finished 2 years of school, and he's up with us. And then my youngest, Colby, he was wrestling yesterday. It's kind of a family disease we have. We're all wrestlers. And so he just did that, and he's 15 and doing really well. And that's where our family is now, and
that's good.
And that's what we're all doing.
That's good. And Colton, how about you? You were 4 years old when all this happened, but you're 20 now. Tell us what you're doing in life right now.
So, like my dad said, I did about 2 years of a ministry college in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and finished that this last May. And now I'm living up in Colorado with my parents, and I am an electrician. So that's what I do.
That's awesome. Good. All right, let's deep dive into heaven, guys. I think the story about Pop is so compelling because as a dad, if you're wondering whether your kid actually experienced heaven or not, this Pop thing made it undeniable for you. Tell us the Pop story.
Well, I think for all of us, how many of you have lost someone and it really hurt? Well, for me, that was Pop. I was almost 7 when he died in a car accident. And at that time, I was so stunned, having to deal with death and having to deal with someone so close to me. I mean, Pop was my world. And my dad was manic depressive, schizophrenic. I didn't have any relationship really with my father, and Pop was it. And but he was like so many other men. I mean, he loved his family, but he was a hard worker. But he kind of sent the family to church, and he didn't go, and he didn't talk much about it. And so my mother, for many years, I would catch her at nights crying. I don't know if my father's in heaven. I'd catch her at night just weeping, like at 2 a.m. in the morning, get up, and she'd be in there crying. And then one day I was riding in a truck with my son, and this is after, we started having conversations about heaven, and different things would just all of a sudden spur memories, or he would start talking. I didn't even know what to ask many times. And we're in a truck, and I'm riding out to this farm site to bid a garage door. I had overhead door business. And he's like, Dad, is Pop your mom's dad or your dad's dad? And I'm like, well, it's my mom's dad. And he's like, he's really nice. And all of a sudden I'm like, what? And then all of a sudden he starts talking about, what I did as a child with him and things like that and how he saw him in heaven. And then we found out more information from my aunt and uncle that never shared with my mother how at a revival meeting, my mom was standing in front of my granddad, and 2 days before he was killed in that car accident, he was at a revival meeting and he raised his hand to give his life to Jesus Christ.
Wow.
2 days. And I remember my mother coming immediately when I said, Colton's talking about Pop. I mean, my mother was a school teacher. She never left school for anything, but she got a sub and she was at our house the next day. It's like, talk to me. I mean, this is my daddy you're talking about. For me, there's healing there in the sense of, I think of Pop, and I think about my daughter, and I think about the people that Colton remembered. And I think God in his grace gave Colton the memories to remember those people that would heal us the most. The losses that hurt the most. We've all gone through losses, and even if you've been a Christian all your life, death is an awful thing. And to be separated, and heaven is like the ultimate solution to death, isn't it? You get to be reunited, no more separation. You know each other. But I remember even with Pop, which was so interesting, I'd take Colton to a picture of Pop as an old man because it's all I had. I knew him as 61. And he would look at him and he'd say, well, Dad, nobody has glasses in heaven. And for many of you, and as I get older, he's like, and Dad, nobody's old in heaven. How many of you like that part about it? It's like, I'm going to have more hair, I'm going to be a little bit thinner, all that sort of stuff. But, in the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve could have lived forever, and sin came into the world, and that's where death and aging came. How many of you know there's no sin in heaven? Okay, how many of you know there's no sin in heaven? I just got to make sure you're awake this morning. So the consequences of sin isn't in heaven either. You ever thought about that?
That's good. So Colton, what was Pop like? Tell us about meeting Pop in heaven.
Well, when I was in heaven, if I wasn't with Jesus, I was with Pop, and he was taking care of me. So it was cool because I got to go over to Pop's house a lot. And how I met Pop is I was in the throne room of God, and then he just came up to me. He said, "Are you Todd's son?" I'm like, "Yeah." He said, "Well, I'm his grandpa." And from then on, he also was taking care of my sister while we were up there.
Oh, wow.
And it's just cool to see that God lets family take care of family.
Wow. So tell us more about your sister.
So with my sister, outside of Jesus and angels, she's the first person I met.
Okay.
And I actually met her technically before I was in heaven. So how I got to heaven is I lifted out of my body during that first surgery, and I could see the doctors working on me. And I was freaking out. I had no idea what was going on. And I was sitting on Jesus' lap. And he had angels sing to me to calm me down. And after that, he had one of the angels fly me to heaven. And when the angels set me down, it was kind of on this road that was going through some gates into heaven. And that's when a little girl just came running out of heaven. And she gave me this giant old bear hug. At the time, I was a typical 3-year-old boy. I was afraid of cooties.
All right.
And I just kind of, why are you hugging me? Like, this is weird. But she ended up letting go and then finally told me, "I'm your sister, and I'm just so happy someone from my family is finally here." And yeah, she wouldn't stop hugging me, but after that, I was okay with it. But yeah, she was the first person I met, and she knew right when I was getting to heaven.
Wow.
And when I met my sister, she was a little bit bigger than me, but not as big as my oldest sister, Cassie. And she had brown hair instead of blonde hair. And yeah, she was just smiling all the time.
Wow. And what did that do to you and your wife when Colton brought that up? Because there was no way that Colton knew that y'all had had a miscarriage.
You know, like he said, he was 3, almost 4, just about a month before his 4th birthday. And you don't talk about babies dying in their mommy's tummies with little kids that age. And for us, the loss of that child was another really big hurt for my wife and I. I remember it was Father's Day. We were going to announce to our congregation that we were having another child. And our congregation consisted of about 12 people. But the night before Father's Day, she lost the baby. I can still remember my wife laying there in the fetal position, just sobbing and crying. And she says, "I can't go to church today." And she felt so hurt. She wasn't ready to share with anybody her loss. And so she asked me to go to church and pretend that everything was okay. The worst Sunday I've ever had. How do you go to church and pretend everything's okay when you just lost a kid? But I did it for my wife, but it struggled and it was hard. I remember that first month, and maybe some of you men too, I didn't know how to comfort my wife. I didn't know what to say to her. Told her I loved her. I knew it wasn't her fault. I told her that. But she had a hard time accepting that. And my mother and her mother had never had a miscarriage. They didn't know what to tell my wife. And as a man, I felt so inadequate to comfort her. But after a month, it looked like she started getting better, and then I started to grieve. And then a month after that, we found out she was pregnant again with Colton.
Okay.
And so we kind of moved forward, but we didn't stop and get healed. Does that make sense? Life kind of just progressed, but we still had this hurt, but we kind of went from hurting about the lost child to praying for, oh God, please make sure this one makes it and we don't have problems this time. And so almost now 4 years later, we're sitting in the front room and Colton comes in and goes up to his mom and says, Mommy, I have 2 sisters. I mean, we were totally unprepared, not even thinking about anything. I mean, 4 years is 4 years, you know?
Right.
But, sometimes you pray prayers that you forget, but God doesn't. And I remember praying, oh, God, how do you fix this? And I didn't know how to pray. And here 4 years later, the answer came into the room.
Wow.
He says, Mommy, I have 2 sisters, and she's not getting what he's trying to say. And she's like, well, you mean your cousins, your friend? What are you talking about? He goes, no, Mommy, you had a baby die in your tummy, didn't you? It was just silence. I mean, we had a small front room. I was sitting at the table. She was over at the sofa. And I could see her and I could hear everything. And I remember my wife leaning forward, who told you I had a baby die in my tummy? I mean, you ever been to like the doctor and he's pointing and he goes, where does it hurt? Where does it hurt?
Huh.
It's like my son just came up and hit this emotional hurt that was there in my wife's life. And he's like, well, she did, Mommy. She told me she died in your tummy. He turned around and went to skip out of the room and my wife exploded. She stood up and screamed, Colton Todd Burpo, louder than I've ever heard it in my life. You get back here. You don't ever tell me something like that and walk away from me. I mean, she's trembling. He's tiptoes back to her. He says, it's okay, Mommy. She's okay. God adopted her. And I remember her putting on her knees, putting her hands on her shoulders and his shoulders, and she's like, you mean Jesus adopted her? And he's like, no, Mommy, his dad did. And then she starts asking her, well, Colton, what does she look like? And he described her to his mother just like he described her to you. I remember coming over then, and it's like, well, and as I come closer, he's like, yeah, she just wouldn't stop hugging me. I didn't like that very much. But then he said this, but she was so happy that someone in her family was in heaven with her. And he looked at me and he looked at his mommy and he said, she can't wait for you to get there. She knows you. She knows me. I never thought of that before. My child, I'm going to get to know, but she knows me. And then he said, Daddy, I told her that you'd give her a hug because when you get to heaven, you'll give her a hug because you always give your kids hugs. And I'm like, well, son, what's her name? I remember him looking at me and he goes, Dad, she doesn't have a name. I'm like, what do you mean? Hasn't Jesus given her a name? And I remember him looking at me and he goes, no, Dad, that's your job. So I just encourage any of you, if you've lost a child, pray about it. God will let you know if that was a little boy or girl, I know. Name your child. It is such a healing part of that process.
Have y'all named her?
Yeah, her name's Kelsey.
Kelsey.
Now, if Sonia was here, she would say Caitlin. But, even the kids agree with me. If we called her Kelsey Caitlin, it would be Cassie and Casey. We could just, it just works. Cassie, Casey, Colton, Colby, right?
Sure.
But yeah.
All right, Colton. So a little while ago, you said, when I was in heaven, and then you said, but that's a big phrase. Yeah. When I was in heaven. What's heaven like? Tell us what heaven's like.
Short answer, it's home.
Okay.
Yeah, that's the best simplified version. It's home. But the cool thing about heaven is when you're there, it's just awesome. Like, you have people there that you get to meet. Mm-hmm. There's angels, there's animals, There's also trees, there's grass, there's water, there's buildings. In heaven, there's more colors than there are down here. And I've had some people ask me, well, what do those colors look like? I have nothing to compare them to. I can't tell you. I just know there's more. There's food in heaven. While I was up there, I ate a lot of pizza and mac and cheese.
Are you serious?
Yeah, it might still be some of my favorite food today. It is. But yeah, I remember eating food in heaven. I had to go to school in heaven because I was a kid. Like, the adults, they did stuff. Nobody was bored in heaven. I'm not too sure what the adults did, but as a kid, I had to go to school. So, sorry to all the kids. School is inescapable. Even in death, you have to go. But on the bright side, Jesus was my teacher.
Works.
That's a pretty good trade-off. But it was cool because in heaven, like, time works differently there. Like, so all the adults in heaven, they're young, like late 20s, early 30s, like basically in their prime. They're young, they're healthy. But the kids in heaven, like my sister I met, if they're miscarried, if they're aborted, or if they die at a young age, God just takes them to heaven, and then they grow up there like they would down here.
Okay.
And yeah, another cool thing is like the animals in heaven. So almost every animal we have down here on earth is up in heaven. So there's dogs, there's cats, there's elephants, there's lions, there's horses. And I remember my two favorite animals was Jesus' rainbow horse, which it was a white horse with a rainbow-colored mane.
Wow.
And then my other favorite animal was a lion, because in heaven, I was able to play with lions like you would a dog or a cat down here. I can't do that down here without like getting seriously hurt.
Right.
So it's one of my favorite memories.
So did you see a golden retriever with a little tag named Levi on it?
So, oddly enough, that's like the second most asked question I always get of whenever people are asking heaven questions. Like, first, are there animals in heaven? Second, is my pet in heaven? I'm not joking.
Sure.
But my answer to that is, I don't know.
Sure. So you didn't meet Levi. It's okay. It's okay.
But it's cool because you also got to interact with, like, God the Father, Jesus, the Holy Spirit. I also got to meet characters from the Bible. So I got to meet King David, Samson, the apostles Peter and John, Mary, Jesus' mom, John the Baptist, Jesus' cousin. I got to meet with the archangels Michael and Gabriel, which they're really cool.
What do they look like?
So in heaven, everybody except for Jesus and the Holy Spirit, they have wings. And they aren't like the tiny wings, they're big wings. And even though we look like angels, we aren't angels, because angels are a lot bigger than us. So back when I was younger, I didn't know like how tall things were. Like, that's 6 feet, that's a meter. Like,
right, sure.
My dad was my measuring stick.
He had a short stick.
So I remember with a normal angel, they were about 1.5 times the size of my dad.
Okay.
The Archangel Gabriel's a little bit bigger than them, and then the Archangel Michael is twice the size of my dad. And he has a really cool flaming sword. Yeah, it's kind of funny because earlier when I would talk about heaven, like back when Heaven is Real first came out, I would always get asked questions, and I would designate them girl questions. Like, what did heaven feel like? What did heaven smell like? As a little boy, I did not care. Thankfully, I've grown up a little bit, and I do know the answer. But you get me talking about a flaming sword, That thing was cool. So the blade of the sword was as tall as my dad, the handle as long as his arm, and then it was always on fire. I remember seeing it and I went, can I have one? I was told no, because I would be too dangerous with it. But that's another way how you can tell the difference between angels and the humans in heaven. It's because the angels always have weapons on them, and they're like medieval weapons, so like swords, spears, bows, and arrows, because Satan's not in hell yet. And you even read in the Bible times when Satan walks right into heaven, so they have to always be ready.
Right. So in the book, you ask Colton about Satan, and you say you saw him, but you really weren't willing to talk about him when you were young. Are you willing to talk about him now?
Yeah. It was something that I didn't really share until right around the time we were writing the book. So quite a few years had gone by, but when I saw Satan, it was an image of him. It wasn't like actually seeing him face to face. And I remember he like switched between two things. So he was either a 7-headed dragon with 10 crowns. It doesn't make sense. Like,
right.
Or what he looked like was an archangel, but instead of having a light above his head, because everybody in heaven, they had this kind of almost flame above their head. It wasn't really a halo. It was a light. He didn't have that anymore. And instead he had 2 horns coming from his forehead. And I didn't know who was bigger, but he was almost eye to eye with the archangel Michael, like height-wise. But if the 2 of them got in a fight, my money's on Michael.
Okay, that's good. Todd, talk to us about time in heaven. I remember in the book, you asked Colton how long he was in heaven. He quickly said 3 minutes. But we've heard more than 3 minutes worth of stuff here. Talk about, as you've reflected on that, talk about time in heaven.
Well, God operates outside of time. That's the only way prophecy works. You know, how does a prophet thousands of years ago tell you exactly what's going to happen thousands of years later? Because God can be in both places at the same time. Okay? In Psalms, it says this, and in 2 Peter, it's quoted again, like with the Lord. You know, a day is 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is a day. And for the math people in here, if you do the math, then a day, 3 minutes, if that equaled 1,000 years, 3 minutes would be 2 years and 1 month, okay? But another thing that, even as I've journaled through Scripture, remember the temptation of Jesus when Satan came to Jesus? And it says in that temptation, in a moment, Satan showed Jesus all the kingdoms of this world. Remember that?
Right.
In a moment. How long would it take to view all the kingdoms of this world in our time? So time has no, what shall we say, bearing on the heavenlies, if you will. They operate outside of time. And so I think that, again, helped me understand, well, man, how in the world could you see so much in 3 minutes? Yeah.
Wow. All right, so I think the most spectacular thing about heaven should be Jesus. Talk to us about Jesus.
Yeah, so Jesus is the first person I saw.
Okay.
And that's why no one gets lost on the way to heaven, because Jesus is the way. He takes them. But it's cool because, like, even with Jesus in the throne room is so cool. I remember seeing God the Father, and he's big. Like, God the Father, he is literally big enough to hold the whole world in his hands. He's got this white robe, got a yellow sash, and then he's got these 2 massive wings. And I remember walking into the throne room, and instead of being scared of someone or something that huge, I just could feel how much God loved me, almost like radiate off of him. And oh, it's so cool. And I remember to his right sat Jesus. Now, how I describe Jesus is he's God, but our size. So, all the power, but I remember with Jesus, I would walk with him. Like, I'd walk with him. He'd teach me. And when I saw him, he had brown hair. He had a brown beard. He had these beautiful bluish green eyes. And he had a smile brighter than any that I've ever seen. He had a white robe. He had a purple sash. And I also remember that Jesus in heaven still had his markers, or the holes in his hands and tops of his feet. Yeah, I just remember being able to walk with him and spend time with him in heaven. And it's cool because even in the throne room of God, to God's left sat Gabriel, the archangel. There was also a chair for Michael. There was an area for the Holy Spirit because the Holy Spirit doesn't really have a body, so he doesn't really need a chair. But when I saw the Holy Spirit, he was kind of like this bluish fog or this bluish flame that he was kind of hard to see, but you could feel it when he's there. I've had some people ask me, well, since you were in the throne room, did you see the 24 elders sitting in the throne room? To me, they were people in chairs. So I guess. I mean, when I was in heaven, they brought me a kid-sized chair to sit in.
Right.
So does that mean I'm an elder? Like,
That's
I kind of look
interesting.
at it through the lens of a kid. They're people in chairs. I saw God. He's the important one.
Right. That's good.
But in the throne room, there was also a pile of rubble that used to be Lucifer's throne.
Huh. Wow. Talk to us, both of y'all. Talk to us about prayer. As I read, when you were in the throne room, you knew your dad needed help, and you started praying for him. What was that like? Was there any tangible expression of prayer? And then, Todd, you talked to us about prayer as well.
So, in heaven, you can actually see almost everything happening down here on earth. And I remember when I was in the throne room, I sat next to the Holy Spirit because I was praying for my dad because I knew he needed it. So your family members that are in heaven, they can see what you're going through and they're praying for you. And it's really cool because I also saw one time when Jesus was kind of showing me one time when my dad was preaching. And I don't know how else to describe it, but it was basically Jesus shot down power to my dad while he was preaching. That's cool.
That's very cool.
But on this side of heaven, prayer is it's been something that I've been familiar with and I've been relearning how to do a lot because I've grown up in church and a pastor's kid. So it's like, I know how to pray. And then it's kind of funny, but whenever you think you know something, God just goes, okay, time to learn something new. So it's been cool for me because I've been learning just kind of more of, instead of saying, my Father who is in heaven, hallowed be your name. I pray that, like, instead of doing that every single time, having a conversation with God.
Right.
Like, instead of jumping through all the hoops, I need to pray for this, I need to pray for this, I need to pray for this. I pray at the crack of dawn every single morning. Just treating God like a friend and talking with him throughout the day. And that's what prayer's been for me, talking with a friend.
That's good. The three of us had a conversation Thursday night on the phone, and we ended our conversation with a prayer. And when I got off the phone, I turned to my wife, I said, wow, when Colton prayed, it sounded like he was talking to somebody he knew. That's awesome. Todd, talk to us about prayer.
You know, I think I've been asked many times if you've read Heaven is for Real, or if you've seen the movie, it shows part of it. But in the hospital, when my son was screaming and yelling at me, and he was being taken back to the emergency room, and he's like, Daddy, make them stop. They're hurting me. Daddy, why are you letting them do this to me? And you can't explain to a 4-year-old why you're letting all these adults poke him with needles, and he's hurting and he's in pain. And everyone's looking at me because everyone knows I'm a pastor. In a small town, in a small area, the the doctor that was on call when Colton went into emergency surgery was the doctor who 3 months before that had done a mastectomy on me. So we knew each other. And that doctor has told me many times, I still remember your son's screams. I can't forget them. And he's just the doctor. And he was screaming so loud, you could hear it all over the halls of the hospital. And there I was as a dad. I think most of you men in the room will probably understand that I always see my job as the provider and the protector for my family. It's kind of like the role of the father. But I hadn't been able to work for months because I'd had a broken leg, and our bills were way out of control, and that was so humbling to me to not be able to work. And then to have my son sitting there screaming at me like, Dad, do your job, protect me. And I had to let him take him. I was so demasculated, like, I'm not even a man, am I? I can't tell you how much I was enraged, and it was just blowing up, but I was a pastor, and everyone's looking at me. And maybe as a Christian, sometimes you've had everyone looking at you, and they're looking at you like, how are you going to handle this? How are you going to respond? And I remember them saying, well, we left some stuff in the pre-op room as they were escorting my wife back out to the lobby. So I went back to that pre-operating room. I know the movie shows me going to a chapel, but I went into that pre-op room and shut the door, and there was a window in there, and I closed the curtain, so it was a private room. And I lost it. I mean, I was so mad. I remember sitting there with God, and maybe you've reasoned with him too, but I said, God, I broke my leg, and I took that. Then I had kidney stones. I took that too. Then I had cancer. And I took that, and now you're going to take my son? I remember standing in that room and saying, God, is it even worth it to be a pastor? I was in a moment where it was like, God, if I've ever needed you, I need you right now. And no one was watching, or so I thought. And that's where the whole I knew my son wasn't making it up when he said, I saw you in a room and you were yelling at God. I watched you, Dad. And I was like, you watched me? And he could tell me where I was and what I was saying. And then later on he said, Dad, Jesus is answering your prayer. That's why I had to come back. In that room, my prayer life has changed to where I've stopped playing Christian when I pray. I've stopped playing pastor. This is me, God. This is me. In our human relationships, we're so guarded that if anyone finds out everything that I've ever thought or said or whatever, they won't trust me as much, or they won't respect me like they do now. I don't know of husbands and wives that have shared everything. I haven't with my wife, and I'm sure she hasn't with me because we're guarded. But do you know God knows everything about you? Remember Peter in the New Testament when Jesus said, tonight you're going to deny me 3 times, and Peter said, no, I would die for you. Who was right? I mean, think about this for a second. God not only knows the bad you've ever done, he knows the bad you're going to do. But when we can be open before him and say, I'm mad, God. I'm hurting, God. God's like, yeah, I know. Now it's time for you to be honest about it so we can talk about it. So I can deal with it, so I can help you through that. We all carry broken pieces sometimes, and I was so broken in that room. I think I was crumbled to powder. I was so broken. But when I could admit that, not to God, but to myself in front of God, my prayer life really changed. At times in your life too, when events go bad and the storms of life hit you, you're gonna want to run like I wanted to run. I had all these eyes looking at me, and I wanted to go hide. But in those moments, you're going to be tempted to run away from God or run to God. Can I tell you, run to God. He can handle you. There's nothing that you can say to God that's going to intimidate him. It's not going to belittle him. He's not going to be afraid of you, but he's going to love you, he's going to listen to you, and he's going to point out things in your life that maybe you didn't even know there, that circumstance is bringing out. And can I tell you this, if he loved Peter, who was going to deny him 3 times, he still loves you too.
That's good.
You know, when you're a child, the best analogy I can have, how many of you have been to the grocery store and they put those little chocolate candy bars right by the cashier so that 2-year-old goes off right as you're getting out the door, right? And we've all been there, right? And our child's been screaming and throwing a fit, and everyone's looking to see if the parent's going to give in, right?
All right.
Okay. Can I ask you this? When your child threw that fit, you might have gotten mad, and you might have had a meeting in the car later when you got outside, but did you ever stop loving that child because of that fit?
Mm-hmm.
When you feel like running, can I tell you, run to God?
That's good.
He might not like what you're saying, but he's still got to love you. And he's going to know how to help you and how to challenge you and how to comfort you and how to be there with you. And Satan's going to tell you all the lies that say, no, he isn't, and no, he's going to get mad at you, and yes, he hates you and all. No. God has prayed for you. You know, Jesus prayed for Peter. He told Peter this, I prayed for you that your faith won't fail. I'm bigger than Satan, Peter.
That's good.
And when you take your problems there in prayer too, and you just be honest, he's still bigger today.
Yeah, that's good. Wow, just the picture that you shared, Colton, of Jesus sending down power to your dad when he was preaching, that helps my prayer life to think, okay, when I pray about something, Jesus sends down power to the person I'm praying for. And then, Colton, I'm sending you back because I'm answering your dad's prayer. Wow. Colton, how do I get to heaven?
Well, when I was in heaven, God's let me remember 2 conversations I had with Jesus.
Okay.
And the first one, he was teaching me. And Jesus taught me, Colton, this is how you get to heaven. If you love me and follow me, my dad's okay with that.
Huh.
And it's that simple. But it's not easy. And as I've been getting older, kind of understanding more, it really is, you have to love Jesus and follow him. Like, you actually need to know Jesus. And I had a friend in college who kind of challenged me with one thing, or he said a phrase when I told him that. He's like, you know, when you truly love someone, you're willing to change for them. And I actually got to talk with some friends where we were talking about that. Where
Is this on earth or in heaven?
On earth.
Okay.
And it was great because it was me and a bunch of other young adults. Some of them were married, some of them were not. And my favorite picture that God gives for our relationship with him is a marriage. Now, I am not married, so I can't speak for married people. But there's some things that I have done that if I was married, I would either be in a lot of trouble or probably dead that I did. Things I used to do. One time I didn't want to do dishes. The dishes were like piled up in the sink, and my parents were gone for the weekend. They were like, Colton, do the dishes. And I'm like, gotcha. But instead of actually going through and cleaning them all, I Febrezed the dishes. So they were still there. And I even added some to it
God
over the
didn't
weekend.
send him back fixed.
That happened one time. But, I mean, back in middle school, instead of doing my laundry, I used to axe my clothes. I'm just saying. And it's kind of cool because, well, that's not cool. But when we treat God like that. Like God asks us, hey, can you do that for me? And we're like, good God, but if we didn't actually do what he told us to, do we really love God? So that's kind of an analogy, I would say,
Sure.
kind of a little bit of a humbling one, but it's cool because the reason why we do things isn't because God says do it, but we do it because we love God that much.
Good.
And for everybody married in the room, there's probably some things that your spouse has asked you to do that you don't even do it because they want you to, but you do it because you love them so much.
That's good. And did you ask Jesus about his markers, and what did he say?
So that was the second conversation I remember having. And I remember when I looked around heaven, everybody was young, they were healthy, they were perfect. But Jesus had the markers in his hands and his feet. And I remember asking him, Jesus, how come you're the only one in heaven with markers? And I remember he got down on a knee. He looked me right in the eyes and said, Colton, it's to remind me how much I love you. And a few years back, I was going through a pretty rough time in my life. And God gave me, I like to call it a little mini movie, because it was basically like a story, but with no words in my head when I was praying. And in this story, there was a man that ended up getting hurt pretty bad. Like, either he did something and basically he was hurting. But instead of talking with people about it, instead of getting help, he decides to pick up a shovel and start digging himself a hole. And this guy digs this hole. He ends up digging it so deep you can't see the top anymore. It's dark, and he feels alone. And whenever people would ask him, hey, how you doing? Felt like he had to put on a mask saying, oh, I'm doing great, how are you? But on the inside felt broken, felt alone. And then finally, something clicked for the guy. He realized he wasn't alone. Jesus was there. But Jesus wasn't at the top of the hole, reaching his arm down, screaming, I can take you out of this. No, Jesus was in the hole with the man. His arm reached out, just saying, give it to me.
That's powerful.
And the man smacks away Jesus' hand, saying, nah, Jesus, I got this, and digs a little deeper. Finally, the man throws down the shovel and collapses. He's frustrated, he's tired, he's spent. And Jesus' hand is back out, just saying, give it to me. So finally, the man grabs Jesus' hand, saying, okay, Jesus. And I remember Jesus flips over his hand, and through that marker, he saw the hand of the man. He saw me. And those words, I still have them to remind me how much I love you. And it just hit home with me, because regardless of what you go through, regardless of what you feel alone in, God's right there. And if you just give it to him, he'll heal you.
That's good, Colton. Thank you. Colton, what would you say to somebody, like, you got to go to heaven, you get to see Jesus. The majority of us have not had that experience. What would you say to somebody who say, I don't know if I can believe unless I go through the experience that you went through?
Well, I'm not too sure. I've talked with a few people where they completely disagree with me. And so far, my response to a lot of that has just been, you can believe what you want to, but I know what I saw. And for people that haven't experienced what I've experienced, I still talk with them. Because the whole goal, regardless of how awesome heaven is I like pointing people back to Jesus.
Yeah.
That's my main goal.
That's good. That's good. Todd, anything you'd say to that person?
I think for most of the people, I think sometimes we need to understand what makes me a Christian is the fact that I know the Bible and I can answer the Sunday school lesson questions. You know, does that make me a Christian? That I can sing the songs in church and go down the list? Or is it because I know God personally? Hell, I've met him. Mm-hmm. He talks to me. He's in my life. And you see, I became a Christian at 9 because God started talking to me. And I responded to that. And finally it was like, well, my mom's true, and what they've been saying at church is true because I finally met God. So I talked to these people. I said, well, I'm not here to defend God, but I can ask you this. Can you pray an honest prayer? And a lot of people are like, what do you mean? I mean, well, can you be honest? Because if God is for real, he knows when you're not, right? He knows when you're trying to play games and you're insincere, and he knows when you don't mean it. But if you can pray this prayer with me, I'll pray it with you. God, will you show me you're for real? And then I ask him to add another prayer to that. God, will you show me that Jesus is your son? You know how many people I guess I've deflated the hostility, the argument, the angst they might have, and I just ask them, if you'll pray that prayer, God is great at answering that prayer, and I'll pray it with you. And for the most, even I've been on TV shows, I've been in all kinds of places with the people with that type of hostility, and I just ask them, if you're honest and can you pray this prayer, I'll just pray it with you. That's all I got. But that's all you need. And I can tell you miracle after miracle how God has answered that prayer if you just challenge someone to pray it.
That's good. That's good. Well, I wish we could go another hour, guys. Actually, we are in next service. But we're going to go ahead and close down this service. It hadn't been good getting to dialogue with Colton and Todd. So I was talking with Todd and Colton last night and talked about different ways we could end the service. And this is in their first rodeo of being in a setting like this. They said, what we most like to do with people is pray with them. And so, pardon me, 12:30, we're going to have a luncheon, a Q&A luncheon. That's when you can ask them to sign your books. That's when we can ask questions and do dialogue. But they want to pray with people. And so we always end our service with prayer altar time. And this whole prayer altar is open. We've got about 20 of us who are here ready to pray with you about whatever's going on in your life. And if you come to the prayer altar and kneel and cup your hands, then one of us will pray with you. We're going to station Todd and Colton over here on the far north end. And if you'd like them not to take a selfie with you or sign a book, come at 12:30 for that. But if you'd like them to pray with you, then you can come and kneel at the altar and cup your hands and wait. And they would love to pray with you. So I'm going to ask you guys to go ahead and go over there. But the prayer altar's open. I'm going to come down here and pray. And then we've gone over a little bit, so we won't actually formally close our service with a closing prayer. Jeff Dietz was going to do that, but instead, when you're done praying, you're dismissed. But this prayer altar's open. Maybe you've lost a pop. Maybe you've lost a young child. Come and pray about that and allow God to minister to you. Maybe you want to pray the prayer that Todd suggested. God, if you're for real, would you show me that you're for real? And would you show me that Jesus is your son? Maybe that's your prayer. Maybe you're ready to invite Christ in your life. You can do that in your seat, or you can do it here at the prayer altar railing. Maybe you've got something else to pray about. This is your time to respond to what you've heard about heaven. You can pray in your seat, pray at the prayer altar. When you're done praying, you're dismissed. But if you'll keep it quiet, so that others who are praying. I'm going to be down here praying. I invite you to join me.